Jarret chapter 13, America in the Cold War and the Civil Rights Years. Now, these two topics, which are very large, very complicated, very complex, are combined within this one chapter. I think it probably should be two separate chapters, but Dr. Jarret and his team put it into one chapter, and so we're going to work at it the best way we can. The terms will be intermixed. There's not a section of Cold War terms and then a section of Civil Rights terms. They're all mixed together. So let us begin. We will start with the first term, Cold War, a period of time after the end of World War II. Again, this is at the end of World War II in 1945, when the two superpowers of the world, the United States and the USSR, competed for global domination on philosophy. Now, this is the key point here. This was a philosophical war, a war of words, not a war of guns. Now, were there some hot parts of the Cold War? Yes, there were. There were a number of key wars, a number of shooting wars in Korea and Vietnam, for example, that heated up the Cold War. There are a number of events that occurred, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, that almost led to World War III or to a nuclear war. But by and large, the Cold War, which started in 1945 and ended around 1990. You could argue it ended in 1989 when the Soviet Union collapsed. You could argue it ended a couple years later when the Berlin Wall came down or when the two Germanys were united. But again, we'll go from about 1945 to about 1990. Yalta. In February of 1945, forgive me, 1945, the Big Three, this should be FDR, not DFR, I'm sorry, it's poor typing, FDR, Stalin and Churchill met to discuss a post-war Europe in Yalta. As the aggressor, the USSR, the Soviet Union, the Russians gained a great deal of Eastern Europe to control. Again, they were the aggressors. Now, again, they had been wounded far more than the other two countries combined. World War II saw upwards of 20 million dead Russians, and Stalin wanted his revenge. He wanted to be paid for those losses of life. So at Yalta, Stalin demanded that he be allowed to keep any territory that he had acquired as he chased the Germans back from Russia toward Germany. Neither the United States, with FDR being sick, we're only a few weeks away from his death, or Churchill, whose country really was in no shape to continue a much longer war or to argue against the Russians. Neither one was really willing or able to fight against it, so Yalta essentially doomed the hundreds of millions of men, women, and children to Soviet domination. The United Nations. This is part of the agreement at Yalta. Again, part of the agreement at Yalta was to create another international body, another one. This is the second attempt within the 1900s to create an international body. The first one, the League of Nations, was a hopeless failure for any number of reasons, and we discussed them previously. We're not going to go into them right this moment. But it was decided that there would be another attempt. The United Nations would be this international body where people could go, countries could go, take their grievances, and hopefully come to solutions before bullets start to fly. The Potsdam Conference. This took place shortly after FDR died, after his death, which was in April. So we're talking a few weeks on the job. President Truman met with Stalin and, of course, Churchill. And there were some differences between this meeting and the meeting at Yalta. Stalin went back on several agreements he had entered into with FDR. Now, there could be any number of reasons for this. Stalin felt that he was operating from a much stronger position because of his military control over Eastern Europe. It could be because he felt that Truman was less than FDR. It could have been because FDR and Stalin had a relatively long-term relationship. I mean, they've been fighting the war against the Germans for a number of years together. FDR called Stalin, the largest mass murderer in world history, called him Uncle Joe. So there was some type of friendship, some type of relationship there that had been maturing over a number of years. And Stalin didn't have that with Truman. Keep in mind, this is also a few months before Truman drops 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. So Truman really didn't have much credibility with Stalin, and Stalin took advantage of it. Our next slide, our first term on the next slide is the Iron Curtain. This is the term used to describe the closing off of communist countries in Eastern Europe. Now again, the Iron Curtain, as has been mentioned to you, is a metaphor. It is not literally a curtain made of iron that was constructed between Eastern European countries and the Western democracies. It is just a metaphor. Okay, travel, communications, trade, everything else were severely limited between the pro-communist East and the pro-democracy West. I have shown you, I believe, on one of the maps on the previous PowerPoint, the boundaries between East and West. Countries like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, they were on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, and the democracies, West Germany, England, France, Italy, were on the west side. And so that line, more drawn on a map than actually physically seen, that line on the map separated the pro-communist countries against the pro-democracy countries. Containment. This is the American policy of not overthrowing communist countries, but rather, and this is a very important word, but rather a policy of maintaining the status quo. And the status quo is a term basically meaning as things are. So containment was not an attempt to destroy, to overthrow, to remove pro-communist governments. No, it was a policy of maintaining the status quo, not allowing communism to spread. Not defeating it, but just not allowing it to spread. George C. Marshall. At this time, under Truman, he was the Secretary of State, and he proposed a massive aid package be created and given to countries that had been war-torn in Europe. He proposed a massive aid package to be given to war-torn countries in Europe to rebuild their economies. Keep in mind, we had just spent who knows how much money and how much time bombing the heck out of countries like Germany and Italy, and countries like France had been attacked and destroyed by the Germans. And so this was a way, the Marshall Plan was a way, and again here is the Marshall Plan down here. This was a way to garner support and influence in those countries, and most importantly, keep the communist influence out. And again, this is really the most important part. We are trying long-term to help rebuild these nations so they will be democratic allies. They will be trade partners with the United States. Short-term, we're trying to keep the commies out of those countries. Marshall Plan, it was very successful. Billions and billions of dollars, upwards of $15 billion, were spent to rebuild nations in Europe that had been devastated during World War II, including some of our former enemies. Now again, this is pretty telling, including our former enemies like Germany, or at least in this case, West Germany, Italy. Though Japan wasn't officially part of the Marshall Plan, we did spend a lot of money helping rebuild Japan to, again, keep communism out and to create some long-term possibilities. Number one, that Japan would be a democratic political ally, which it did become. And number two, it would become, long-term again, a trade partner, and it has become one of our leading trade partners in the country, in the world. Our next slide, we are going to begin with NATO. Right there. NATO is an acronym, and the acronym stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The NATO was made up of the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations. It was an alliance that's goal was to provide military assistance in the case of a Russian attack. So NATO was a counter to the Soviet Union. We're looking at originally 12. Now the number has grown over the decades. NATO was still around, by the way. The original 12 was a military alliance that would provide military assistance in case of a Russian attack. So if the Russians attacked France or West Germany or any of the European allies, the United States would militarily aid them against the Russians. Now the Russians, on the other hand, created the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was the USSR's response to NATO. It created this pact between itself and its Eastern European satellites. Keep in mind, the Soviet Union is a confederation of nations. There's 18, 19 of them. And then you throw in the Eastern European satellite nations, those countries that were propped up by the Russian military, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, on and on and on. Those countries together formed the Warsaw Pact. Its job was to be a counterbalance to NATO. Now, what did NATO provide? What did Warsaw Pact provide to the Soviet Union? It provided collective security. Each NATO nation pledged to come to the military aid if a fellow NATO state was attacked. And of course, the same thing applied to the Warsaw Pact. So each nation pledged militarily to aid the other nation in case they were attacked. The Berlin Wall, a wall constructed around West Berlin. West Berlin is in the country of East Germany, and I've explained this to you in another video, so there should not really be a need to go into greater depth. The idea behind the Berlin Wall was keeping the people of East Berlin from escaping communist control, and they were going to escape communist control by going to West Berlin. So if you, a person who was stuck in East Berlin because you lived on the wrong side of the street when the city was divided, all you have to do is get to West Berlin and you're free. So if you're in East Germany, you get to East Berlin, you can get to West Berlin, you're free. If you're Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, or any country that's controlled by the Soviet Union, controlled by Russia, controlled by the Politburo, controlled by Joseph Stalin, if you could get to West Berlin, you are free. In order to prevent that from occurring, in order to prevent millions, potentially millions of people escaping his domination, Stalin ordered the building of, sorry, not Stalin, forgive me, Stalin's dead by now. Russia ordered the building of the Berlin Wall. And keep in mind, the Berlin Wall was constructed in 1961. All right. Our next slide, Mao Zedong. He was the communist leader who led the overthrow. Mao led the overthrow of the pro-democracy forces in China. This is in the late 1940s. We are just a few years removed from the end of World War II. The Russians had had been able to rebuild their military, had been able to spread their communist influence in certain parts of the world. And keep in mind, China and Russia share a border. And so Mao, the communist leader, overthrew the pro-democracy forces in China led by a man named Chiang Kai-shek. Mao then proceeded to set up the world's largest communist nation in the world. Now, China is the second largest country in terms of physical size. It was the largest nation in the world in terms of population, as it still is. The pro-democracy group fled and eventually landed on the island of Taiwan, where it set up a pro-democratic, capitalistic, highly successful country. To this day, China wants Taiwan back. Again, it was settled by Chinese. The difference is Taiwan is capitalistic, democratic, and highly successful. China is the opposite. Red China, which is a name we use to discuss communist China, Red China would, if it could, it may be able to one day, if it could, it would invade Taiwan and take it over. Korea. Former Japanese colony was divided into two separate countries after World War II. The North was pro-communist and the South was pro-democracy. So we're looking again at a divided country. Korea is on a peninsula. The North was pro-communist, the South was pro-democracy. The North launched the war of aggression against the South. The North invaded the South. The United Nations, which had been created a short time earlier, stepped in, led by American forces. The United Nations sent a peacekeeping force into South Korea to drive the North Koreans out of South Korea. The UN forces, led by Americans, the Americans dominated this contingent, drove the North out of the South. The South Korean forces, aided by the UN forces, mostly American forces, were able to drive the North Communist Army out of the South. And after a little over a year and a half, an armistice was signed, which remains in effect to this day. There has been a lot of anger, animosity, confusion over the boundary, which is roughly at the 38th parallel. The movie that came out a couple years ago, Olympus Has Fallen, is about North Korean agents infiltrating the White House with the help of a former Secret Service guy who's now a bad guy, and trying to force the president to pull the American forces out of South Korea and remove our naval assets, which protect the South, or help protect the South from the North. To this day, the North would love to invade the South and reunite Korea. Let us do one more slide, and then we'll stop this video. We'll finish it up with other videos down the road. Douglas MacArthur. He led the UN forces during the Korean War. He was the man in charge. Now, Douglas MacArthur, we discussed previously in World War II. He was the Army general in charge of the island hopping campaign. You can go all the way back to the Bonus Army March in the early 30s that he was called in to put down rather violently, if you remember. And so he was sent to invade the South, to aid the South against the North. He was able to push the Northern forces back almost to the Chinese border. And again, we've taken a look at this on a map in a previous video. The Chinese warned the Americans through diplomatic channels that if the American army approaches the Yalu River, which is the boundary between North Korea and China, if the Americans approach that river, then the Chinese will take this as an act of war against China, and they will retaliate. When MacArthur sort of ignored that and continued pushing the American troops forward, again, he wanted to, as it states right here, he wanted to liberate China from communist control. And he was even willing to use atomic bombs if necessary. Truman, his boss, agreed. Keep in mind, Truman is the President of the United States. He is the Commander-in-Chief. MacArthur is a general. He works for the Commander-in-Chief. When Truman disagreed with this strategy that MacArthur had, MacArthur was told, don't do it, forget it, you can't do it. MacArthur then criticizes Truman in public, and Truman then fires MacArthur. MacArthur is a great general. He was one of the best American generals in the war. He is a all-time great. If there were baseball cards, trading cards of generals, he would be on one of them. He'd probably be the ace of spades, but you get the idea. But because MacArthur, kept pushing our forces to the Chinese border, the Chinese attacked the American forces and drove us back into the South. So MacArthur lands in South Korea. He pushes the North Korean forces all the way back almost to the Chinese border. The Chinese said, don't get close to us or we'll take that as an act of aggression against us. MacArthur ignores that, keeps pushing his troops. He has made it known that he would love to liberate the country of China from communist control, and he's even willing to use atomic bombs if is necessary. Truman disagrees with the strategy. MacArthur criticizes Truman. Truman fires MacArthur. The war ends with the armistice that is still in place to this day. Hydrogen bomb, a more powerful weapon than the original atomic bomb. As the years go by, our scientists are experimenting with the ability, with their knowledge, their ability to split the atom, to harness it, to use it as a weapon, and we're developing bigger, better, badder, more destructive weapons. And the hydrogen bomb is one of those. Our last one, deterrent. Anything that stops the other side from attacking. A guy rushes you in the street, you pull a knife, that knife is a deterrent. A guy in the street attacks you with a knife, you pull a gun, that gun is a deterrent. Our atomic bombs were our deterrent. They kept the USSR from attacking us, and when the Russians developed their own nuclear weapons, that kept us from attacking them. So our nuclear arsenal kept Russia from attacking us because they knew that we would retaliate and use those weapons against them. We wouldn't use atomic weapons against them. They wouldn't use those atomic weapons against us. All right. This is the end of the first part. So make that one a little prettier. There we go. It's a little prettier. There we go. And so we have now just ended part 1 of our look at chapter 13, vocabulary. And we are gone.